We'll start our second panel. This panel will take a deeper look at the hyper-connected healthcare industry and all of the implications that go along with that. This panel again will be moderated by Haley, and I'll turn over to her to introduce the panelists and begin the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for the introduction. This is our second panel of the day, and we will be focusing again on the promises and perils of digital innovation in the healthcare industry. So we'll try to be extra lively. I know that we've got some food coma setting in out there. And we'll begin the exact same way we did last time. Everyone will give a brief 3-minute introduction of themselves and what they'd like to talk about. We'll do some questions, and then we will also open it up to questions from the audience. And I'll pay better attention to time this time. So please write down those questions, and we'll open up the microphones. Great. So let's begin with Phil O'Reilly at Brocade.
So thanks, Haley. I'm Phil O'Reilly. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Brocade. Brocade is an infrastructure provider. Probably not familiar with us, or if you are, you think of us as your storage area networking provider. That's kind of our legacy in the data world. I come to Brocade from another technology company, Juniper, which you're probably familiar with. I ran the enterprise business there for quite a number of years and then came over to Brocade based on the promise of technology. And I was chatting with many of you in the break as well. I feel like the set of brown shoes in a room full of tuxedos, in that infrastructure is one of those inconvenient things that we rarely talk about. We just assume that it's there and it just works, sort of like throwing the switch and your power comes on, or turning the faucet and water comes out. It's not quite as simple as that. It plays quite a fundamental role, not only in the current deliverable environment, but also, frankly, the evolution towards a lot of the things we talked about this morning. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit if I get the chance. The simple reality is that the infrastructure that exists today is built on a nearly 20-year-old, someone might argue a 25-year-old model. And that model is not adequate to support the demands of healthcare or, frankly, most other infrastructures. The other thing that struck me when I was asked to participate today was this conference was on innovation. The natural bias, and I've seen it in conversations in the panels as well, is in the application layer, the point of service layer, the device layer. And I don't think we think about the fact that innovation is also available to you in terms of automation and scalability and responsiveness and embedded security as part of the deliverable mechanism. We always tend to focus on the shiny penny on top. And I said to Haley, to me, it's sort of like an iceberg. We've been talking about the top. Unfortunately, I want to talk about the bottom. Okay?
Sure. I'm Nancy Green. I'm the Global Practice Lead for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Verizon. And most people, and I've been doing this for about 7 years at Verizon. I've been in healthcare, working with healthcare for about 25 years. But even after 7 years, I get the question of, I didn't know Verizon was in healthcare. When you look at what we look, a lot of it is that bottom part too. But as Verizon is a global company, you look at us from whatever you're used to looking at us from. So if you have a phone, we had that conversation over here. Everybody's got Verizon phones. It's like, thank you very much. But there's a whole big global piece and an enterprise piece that Phil and I kind of work together with on securing and making sure that core piece works well. And we'll talk about what that means. And I completely agree with you on innovation, because innovation, not just the shiny object, but innovating how you consume your network, because it has to be great. But it's also around the advisory services on that. The application layer doesn't have to just be the shiny object. It's how do you collaborate as well. And so Verizon covers all of that. Our practice for Verizon looks at, again, globally, but it's all the pharmas, the payers, the providers, the IDNs, the delivery network. It really covers the full expanse. So that, and in my role, I get to see all that across the country and across the globe. So it really makes it for a very interesting integrated story of what people are trying to do with a lot of the disruptors that are going on.
Great. I'm Russ Cucina. I'm at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm a practicing physician in hospital medicine, and I'm the Chief Health Information Officer for the UCSF Health System. So I think I'm going to be that guy who drags that conversation back up to where the patients and the clinicians
To the shiny
are.
objects.
So I appreciated Dr. Dehner's remarks in particular about her experience in practicing in the armed forces, where she was often in forward deployed situations where there wasn't a lot of technology. I'm in a completely different situation where in Northern California, we are positively swimming in information and technology. And the challenge that we have is how do I help my physicians, my patients, my clinicians of all kinds manage the success of the interoperability of the electronic health records in Northern California. There's a lot of good that can be done there, and there's been a lot of very interesting unintended outcomes and consequences, and I can go into some more detail, tell stories about that if that's of interest. So I live half in the world of the unsung heroes that make it all happen to my right, but always try to bring it back into the service
Reality.
of health and the service of the clinicians. So.
Well, thank you very much. And we have, we were going to have a fourth panelist here if you saw that on your schedules. Parsa Mirhaji was marooned in the Newark airport for 10 hours and was unable to come out here.
Valiantly tried to get here.
Yeah, right. But it looks like we have more than enough to talk about among the four of us here. So let's actually begin from the bottom up. Let's discuss, let's start with a big question of what does the bottom of that iceberg look like? How is the network as it exists now good enough?
Well, I'll sort of take a crack at that. The sentiment is generally good enough is good enough. And the answer to that question is that's a complete falsity. This rigid, topologically capacity planned environment, which is built for a day when we use client-server environments only, just simply doesn't cut it in what we're doing right now. It's not scalable. It's not amenable to automation. It's not amenable to virtualization. And these are all trends that exist and have existed for more than a decade in the industry. It's interesting that people are completely comfortable with this high degree of automation at the application layer. I mean, who here has a network that doesn't have virtual technology at the application layer? Of course, our experience in data says that that is also a trend in the storage environments. And yet, inexplicably, this fabric that connects those two together, and even more fundamentally, connects them to an end user, has not been addressed. It's still stuck in this old, way of thinking about it. So good enough is not good enough. Good enough is not good enough because of the need for visibility, for analytics, for scale, for automation, but most fundamentally because of security. The platform as it exists today, as it's distributed, this old IP infrastructure, as contrasted to the new IP infrastructure, where the infrastructure itself is a platform on which any kind of service, including a security service, can be not only distributed ubiquitously, but becomes mobile. Mm-hmm. Have the ability now to associate a demand, an application, and a data set in a particular place and wrap policies around that in a highly automated and secure fashion. That requires an underlay. Until we can do this telepathically, we're going to need to connect these things together. And that underlay, which is what we work on together, needs to have those characteristics. The reality is that the cloud and these kinds of capacities are capacities which are being consumed across industries, but healthcare has been a true laggard in adopting these technologies compared to others. Some that you'd be really surprised in. The US federal intelligence community is one of the largest consumers of this technology. The Department of Defense is a huge consumer of this technology. Why? Because it serves an immediate need, which is this ability to flex, to deal with unpredictable demands, with all different kinds of data flows and with a whole set of parametry around it. And the new IP is really the way to go. So people have to start with that. My proof of that is a simple concept. I say we need this mesh, this interconnect that ties us all together in this hyper-flexible, scalable, automated way. And people say, well, what's your proof of that? And I give them one idea, the internet itself. The internet has been, you have to admit, remarkably successful. And what is it? It is fundamentally a meshed, automated underlay. So why wouldn't I want my particular environment or environments to mirror that and essentially have this miniature environment which looks and acts and feels is manageable and executable in the same format as the internet itself?
I think I'm never probably going to disagree with you in here, but I think on the earlier panel we talked about kind of disruptors or incentives. That's how it's going to change. And the work that we've done, especially with our large clients, is looking at the disruptors that's in disrupting their business. So what's coming down the path, and those disruptors are going to force them into a new way to do their network. So if you look at the immense amount of partnerships and mergers and acquisitions that are happening, this is quickly they got to get data from one piece to the other or divest one or the other. That takes a very agile infrastructure to do that. You look at this care anywhere. You can't do that without a very strong ability to have a network with the collaboration layer on top of that and any other shiny objects you want on top of that. You can't do that without a strong ability to move fast. The new payment models, I think Frank said you're in one side of, 1 foot in one side of pay performance and fee for value, reversed. We're in that a little bit too. We have immense infrastructure in the ground, but you need to consume it in the cloud. So as a network kind of company and a cloud company, we have to look at how do we best support you. I think the first panel talked a little bit about it too, is consumerism. Consumerism is driving change for you to run your business, or providers to run the business, or payers to run the business. And I spend most of my time with our C-level customers in how do they take their business, change it completely, because we were just in a large meeting, and I had one very large integrated delivery network in California that their CIO was very it was almost like he was upset that he had to add chat to his website because the millennials wanted to chat versus the big contact center and call center he had, right? And it was this changing of how things are happening changes the technology and changes the way that they have to interact with that. So the consumerism is pushing it.
So let me give you guys a use case, and maybe it'll be an opportunity for those of us on the applied side to understand what you're getting at. So in my world, one of the big things that's coming is the substitutable medical applications reusable technologies, or SMART.
I was going to say, what's that acronym?
Right. So it stands for SMART. I obviously awkwardly fit into an acronym, but it's a federally sponsored innovation. You can think of it as DARPA-like, although it's not coming out of DARPA, where the idea is, as we heard earlier, meaningful use has been incredibly successful in bringing electronic health records, enterprise electronic health records, to lots of places across the country. But they have been the legacy incumbents. And that's a recognized problem. And so part of what this project is about is to create a framework, and ultimately perhaps a requirement, that somebody like me, someone who's responsible for 3.3 million individual medical records inside of a software application, will be able, and perhaps required, to have any one of my patients come to me with any consumer app that they choose, not me, but they, and I will not have the opportunity to say yes or no. I will have to say yes, and allow them to connect their favorite consumer application to the electronic health record through APIs or through FHIR or other technologies. So with my doctor hat on, I think that's fantastic. I think the opportunity for disruption in health IT and healthcare in general, moving away from the big legacy data systems into the disruptive applications that we see everywhere else, I think it's a tremendous opportunity. With my administrator hat on, I work for a pretty big place with a great IT shop.
Right.
And that still makes me enormously nervous that I think everything we do to keep control over all of the endpoints where our health data has to be served out. And now the endpoint is going to be a consumer device with a consumer application about which we have no control and may know very little. And now I'm going to be serving health information right out of my system into that device or that app. So that's something that's coming, and we, as a pretty big place, are gearing up to support that. If you're a smaller community hospital, if you're a group of physician offices, and you see this coming and you see this demanded, how do you, if you guys are representing the industry over here, how are you going to support the healthcare system in
I
making
feel
that
like
happen?
a little bit of us and them over here.
Yes. Well, so
You started it.
No, I know.
so let me
Sorry, I'll agree with you too.
let me kind of say, Russ, why this seems so challenging to, classic network people.
Yeah.
Because you think of that intermediation between this end user and their self-serving demands against what you consider to be a fixed addressable infrastructure as a provisioning problem. And how do we solve that problem today? To a great extent, human beings are involved. The other, I think, misunderstanding people have is they think of this connection, this edge, as a place where I connect to your network. So let me disabuse both of those notions.
Okay.
First, the notion of an edge. If you really ask yourself, what is the edge? It's not a place. It's actually a concept. I have an end user who has a set of demands they want to assert. So user control is a big part of this new IP. And they want to address this. So what do I do? Well, I know who are they, where are they, how are they connected, what should they have access to, what time is it, et cetera, et cetera. And classically, what I would do is I would provision a set of services, firewalling, routing, WAN acceleration, whatever the service was against that request. But since all of those services in this new world don't have to be expressed physically in your network, they're all virtual. I have all these virtual capabilities. I can transport those services collected in a container to the place where this person is connecting to me, and I can wrap that interaction with this set of policies. If I have a control environment, so-called software-defined networking, it's a terrible term. I actually think SDN these days, in many cases, stands for sales-defined networking, to be honest with you. But if you think about software-defined networking, you think about now you've built this control, a set of policies expressed in many cases as a plain language environment, which then evokes these services in an automated way against the demand and deploys them. And when the session ends, it simply removes them, puts them back into the repository of mobile services. And that continues on an infinite basis. We're working with all of the big tier 1 service providers, but certainly with our compatriots here on the left in executing this model at scale with the mission that by the 2025 time range, anybody that connects to a network with their cell phone will have their own network. Networks of one. And you think to yourself, I could do that today with VPNs, virtual private networks. I need, 100,000 people configuring them now on a continuous basis to make that reality. The technology exists today to automate that process and create not just the connection, but the customization of services and user demand. So you give, within the limits of what you have to offer, control to your end user. That's existing technology today.
Let me just yank that out of just
Yeah.
bring it high again, because what we're all going for, everyone in the room would want, is that any of those applications that anyone comes at UCSF with and says, I have this patient-facing interface, I have this new app, I have this new innovation, you'd want to just basically attach it to whatever network exists in the world. And you'd want the network in San Francisco to be communicating with the network in Maine. And you'd want that entire thing to be entirely secure, right?
Right.
That's the ideal world in which we're talking about. But the reality, and I think what you're saying, Phil, is on the bottom level, on the foundational level, it's actually this patchwork of
Silos.
rusty pipes and silos.
Yes.
So
We've cleaned the rust up. It's not rusting anymore.
Okay, so the problem is just that they're siloed and they're not speaking
They're
to each other.
siloed. I think, just like any innovation, as we start to innovate that network layer, to bring it to the conversational, I'm going to call it the app layer, but not just a record. I want information from your EHR. Now I have at the edge, wherever that consumer or patient is, I can also do post-op videos. I can do content. I can do interactions with that person. I now know who they are, where they are. It's a secure environment with them. I now have a relationship with that patient. So it's even being able to collectively do what you might even do internally within your organization siloed, to be able to then pull them all together and really end edge piece or location becomes a very interactive content. Kind of think of being able to use whatever device you have, whatever network you have, anywhere in not technically the world, in whatever content I want within your system. So it's not just your EHR, it's actually anything else that's in there as well.
So do these network providers have a financial incentive to create this unified structure?
I wouldn't say it's a financial, other than a competitiveness, right?
Well, I mean, I have an 8-year-old. We live on a farm. She sells the eggs to our neighbors. She took her money to Wells Fargo.
Uh-oh.
They thought it was delightful at 6 years old that she could fill out the paperwork, until she said to the bank manager, "Can I see my money on my iPad?" And the bank manager flipped out. He said, "What does she want?" I said, "Online banking access." She said, "She's 6 years old." I said, "Yeah, deal with it, lady." Right? This is the world that we live
Absolutely.
in. She is not a Wells Fargo customer today. So, and hospitals, we said today, you're differentiating. You're competing for your patients.
Brand has never been more
Healthcare is,
important.
higher education is the same. 98% of students say the digital experience on campus is relevant in their decision about where they're going to school.
Absolutely.
So doctors will decide to work in certain environments based on their ease of accomplishing the tasks that they need. So ultimately, the ability to provide these services is going to be fundamental to maintaining a competitive advantage.
That's one of the disruptors I was talking about, is the way that the consumers, your 8-year-old wants to consume information. Same thing, think of it as a patient. How do you want to do this? Not 2 years ago, at one of a large meeting of our clients, they wanted to talk about how did Verizon change? How did we become a mobile-first company? If you look at our website, it's written completely so that you could be on a mobile phone for it, not the web. How did we do that? And that's a 3-year process for us to be able to do that. So they wanted help on how do I become consumer friendlier, right? And that was a big change for a lot of these clients to do that. And it was because of brand. Because customers are saying, I don't have a Cleveland Clinic in my backyard. I get to choose from these 3 or 4, and whoever brand that I trust is what I'm going to go use. What digitally am I able to interact with them easier on is the brand that I choose, and I'm fairly loyal to that until you to break
Do
it.
you see that, Russ? Do
yeah,
you
and I
think
can
that
tell you,
your
I mean,
digital
even-
environment's important for that?
Even
competitive
with
advantage?
even with a UCSF or a Stanford in your backyard, to name
Yeah.
our principal respected competitor, the land rush is on to provide the best possible digital experience to the patients, to their HR manager, to their large employer, to the payor that their benefits manager contracts with,
Right.
and further to the ambulatory pharmacy, to the mail order pharmacy, to the long-term care facility, to the home
entire
care
care
facility,
continuum.
the DME
Yeah.
provider, all of those. The patient, the HR manager wants to hear that that's going to be an integrated system and that the information is going to flow, because that's what's going to create the positive experience for the patient. And people are choosing based on those experiences now. And places like mine, we've built a brand reputation around our tertiary and quaternary services, our referral services. And that's great and still an important part of our brand. But increasingly, places like mine and everywhere are having to make this part of the healthcare system brand promise that you make. We heard earlier that people used to love their doctor, and I'm a doctor, and I hope people always will love their doctor or their nurse practitioner or whomever cares for them. But I think supplemental to that, in fact, people see themselves as enrolled in a system of health provider, and places like the Mayo and Cleveland Clinic and everywhere else are increasingly putting themselves forward in that fashion, and part of that promise is going to have to come a service promise.
Right.
So actually, I wanted to, the UCSF model is or the California model is one of the ones that works a lot better than other states and a lot
Yep.
better than other regions. So can you just give us the quick and dirty on how you got there and what it looks like?
Sure. So healthcare in California is highly consolidated around a small number of very large delivery systems, particularly in Northern California. Northern California, there's about 6 providers of care, and I won't say that's it, but that's probably 98% of the care that's provided. And that's been true for quite some time, and it's a different conversation why that is. So all of them now have end-to-end enterprise electronic health records. They happen to be mostly on a particular piece of software, but not all of them are. And so within that competitive, very competitive network of care providers, I have collaborated with my peers at all of those other places to lower the barriers to health information exchange across those systems. So today in Northern California, by and large, everybody's notice of privacy practices and terms and conditions of service say to the patient, we believe that you want us to share your information with the other providers of care that you see, and we are going to do that. And if you don't want us to, you're going to have to tell us that, but otherwise we will. And we are no longer collecting special permission for the exchange of medical records in almost any settings. Further, we have automated record locator services so that when I'm a hospitalist, I see a patient in the emergency department. As soon as that patient was registered, our system looked all across Northern California for everywhere else that patient has ever been seen, did an automated query for all of those records, and then brought all of those records from those outside systems into my EHR so that the first time I open it, everything that has ever been written about that patient anywhere in Northern California and increasingly the state is already at my fingertips. So it's wonderful. I could go into the cognitive and user interaction challenges that creates if we want to go there. But really, there were no financial incentives to do this. One could argue financial disincentive to do this, since we are networking with our competitors in that regard. But really, the patient care mission won out in that conversation. We all agreed, let's compete hammer and tongs on care, service, value, all those other things. But let's not compete on this, because it's wrong to do so. And that was supported by senior leadership and has been a big success.
There's a perfect analog to the network that underlays that. So the paradigm was always build something and then add differentiation with proprietary protocols or kind of uniqueness to my technology. I'm advocating for Brocade and with this concept of the new IP, an absolute fanatical commitment to open standards. Not just interoperability, but standard input methodologies, predictable output methodologies. So now it's not a matter of I can replace this switch with this switch. I can take an entire layer of my infrastructure, my software-defined network control, put someone else in there, and it will operate out of the box on day one. So you take that to the end, and people say to me, as they would probably say to you, Russ, well, if you follow that to the conclusion, you've completely commoditized what it is that you're providing into the marketplace. And I said, no. What we've done is we've given our customers the opportunity to make a choice based on their evaluation of the value that we bring here. And so they're choosing us, not based on the fact that they're snookered into coming here because the only place that I can go and still get this. No, we're now competing on a level playing field, and we're able to express our differentiation as a company and convince people that we actually have the edge there.
I'm going to guess, though, that it was a business decision first, not a technical decision. It
was a clinical decision first.
It was a clinical decision before the
tell
technology.
I'm a doctor, I resist you calling it a business. But it was, I know what you mean. It was not the
There's not an IT guy calling you
The
going,
IT people didn't say, hey, we have this, I have a widget.
Right,
Do you
I
have a
can
use
connect
for
you
my
with all
widget?
of your competitors.
Absolutely
Do you want
not. It was myself and the people like me at other places who said, here's a problem that my internal customers, my clinicians need solved, and there's emerging technology to solve it. Let's do that.
Right. Yeah, I think and we talked earlier about this, that's very unique. That is not across the country. Very siloed organizational structure, even in this city itself. There's not sharing going on. And it has to do with clinical staff getting together or business staff getting together to say we have to solve a bigger problem, not an IT problem. Because it really isn't an IT problem. We can do anything with technology. It's, and it continues to innovate where you don't even see it innovating on the underneath side of that, right? So when the best opportunities for us is when the clinical or business side get together to solve a big problem and let us do our stuff to help you get there, right? I think is the best way that we work on.
So taking it to the perils side of this discussion, we've talked a little bit about the promise, and UCSF and the California system is a great example of that. But how do those records are only as secure as the network that you're built on. And I think that's Phil's point. So how do we move forward from here? Can you retrofit a network to make it secure? Can you, do we actually go into these pumps in people's rooms? How do we demand that?
Well, I would argue yes. In fact, that's the only way you can do it.
Right.
There's a $2-3 trillion installed infrastructure that's legacy.
You're not going to be able to forklift that out.
It's ridiculous to even consider lifting it out. That's a weapon that the really large incumbents in the industry use as an excuse for not making any changes, right? They give you the FUD around the difficulty and the complexity, and there's no rollback, and you have to learn all new skills, and you're a hardware guy, this is software-based, whatever. The trick is not only just this commitment to this open standard environment, and these are created by the IEEE, by the NIH, by entities which are designed to do this. And this is a 100-year legacy, particularly in electronics, of standardized boards creating these standards. UL is a good example. Our power grid interoperates because of the absolutely universal commitment to a set of standards. But the trick is to be able to do that, to introduce this programmable, scalable, automated technology in a way that when I introduce it, I get an immediate benefit, but it then becomes a step, like a Lego block, in this ultimate process of building a new underlay transport infrastructure, a transformation of my services environment, and then a new kind of control, the introduction of new ways for networks to communicate with each other, like OpenFlow and some of these other standards. So I use the example of introducing fabric technology in an environment that connects to your applications, because your applications are now being written in a way that they're intended to communicate with one another. Well, your infrastructure isn't optimized for that. It's optimized for traffic that comes in the bottom, goes to the application, then goes back out, not across applications. So by introducing a fabric in that layer, I've now optimized my virtualized machine environment for visibility, for mobility. I get an immediate benefit, but now I have the first step towards this mesh, this fabric. I can do that in another data center. I can connect those two fabrics together and make a single logical fabric. Now the concept of a data center becomes a logical, not a physical. I can go to Verizon and I can take cloud services from them or from Azure or from Amazon Web Services, and I can connect them logically and easily in a very automated way. Same with services. I begin to think about, do I really want to deploy this service as a physical device the next time, a router or a firewall? Do I want to think about maybe taking this step towards a virtualized service environment, first statically and then mobily? And that's the process. And that can be done. We have customers in every stage of the process. Typically, it's a 5 to 7 year journey. But if you don't start, you're going to be behind the 8 ball.
I think if you look at, so what Russ just did was Phil. The infrastructure and how to build that is absolutely important. But one of the things that when you talk about security has to do with all these breaches that we're hearing about. Mm-hmm. When you look at the breaches, and part of one of the services that Verizon does is the Data Breach Investigation Report, which looks at all the breaches globally. But we specialized this last year because of all of the healthcare ones that had to be notified now. We did an entire search and work on what were those. And 73% of the breaches were physical theft, misuse, or insider misuse. It wasn't the network. It was a lost laptop. It was someone who shouldn't be doing something that they're doing,
Clicking
or
on
just an error. Somebody sent the wrong thing to the wrong person. That's 73% of the problems and the breaches that happened. That's pretty big. When you look at some of the other industries, because we do it by industry, retail was all point of sale, was where all the breaches came through. So for healthcare, it really is, no matter how great and secure you build the network, you also have to add the people factor into it. And that's a big, strong factor to it.
So Russ, you're the operating directly with the people.
Yeah.
What is UCSF doing to guard against that?
Sure. So one of the things you can do is you can set up your network. Now I'm going to talk about networks. How about that?
We'll call you a
Robert.
clinician.
You can set up your network such that you can't connect a device to the network unless that device will accept a piece of software that looks at the device itself and controls it. So mobile device management, and that goes for laptops to anything else. So you can't connect to our network unless your device is encrypted, fully patched, and adhering to a whole long list of other security policies. And that's what assures us that when that laptop is stolen out of the trunk of one of my provider's cars, that we know that it's a shame we lost that laptop, but no one is going to get at the information on that laptop, because if they connected it to our system to get those data, that thing was full disk encrypted and
nothing's on the laptop.
Every other measure that we would want to take. Similarly, we don't run our EHR application on essentially any of our client devices. It's all virtualized. It's all we do is push pixels onto that device. So if that device has, God forbid, a virus, I mean, we have ways to prevent that, but if that device is insecure in any other way, all we've done is pushed pixels onto that device, and so there's no data there.
So from the hacker's perspective, it's always, how do you make money from this, right? Or how do you, blackmail an important figure with their medical records?
So I'll tell you how to make money on it, and then I'll ask these folks how they're
He's
going
just doing it in theory,
how
not
they're
that
gonna
he's made
prevent
any
that.
money on this.
So
ransomware here.
So this is
Yeah.
that's where I'm going, right?
The
so,
MedStar specter is over all of this.
I was going right there. I was going to spare them being called out, but that's okay.
The journalists will do it.
Yeah, well, yeah. So you don't have to steal any data to make money. All you have to do is disable the hospital,
Right.
and they'll do just about anything to be let go. So MedStar had the misfortune of making the headline. They are far from the only. There were several in Southern California, a big one in Kentucky, other places where nobody stole any data. All they did was lock up every desktop computer and say, if you would like access to your computers again, you need to send us $17,000 in Bitcoin. And the hospital is faced with a terrible choice. Do we pay ransoms, which nobody wants to do, or do we go without our electronic health record for who knows how long? And if your first priority is to care for the patient, you got to pay the ransom, because you can't take your problem and make that the patient's problem. And so you've got to do it.
And in that case,
And so that's
people
where
were-
you see it's happening.
Yeah, what we've seen actually, since a lot of that's happened, our security practice has seen when that has happened, there's been several cases now where they've actually said, I'm not going to pay. I'm going to tell the story up front and not let them have any leverage, right? Which is a brand
tough
hit.
choice.
That is a hit on the brand, like, you've named some of them already. And that piece of it is hard, but that's a choice that they make not to do the ransomware, but it's absolutely true.
Well, I mean, I'll back way off it being it is a
Yeah.
brand hit, but meanwhile,
Right, the EHR.
you've got
right,
sick
you have a
people in
problem.
your
Yeah,
hospital,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
You've got an ICU full of sick people. You've got
Yeah.
open cases in your operating room where the electronic health record is the real-time anesthesia system, and suddenly you don't have access to those systems. So forget for the moment brand. I mean, you've got that responsibility that you're bearing, and it's
You know what they all
compelling.
have in common, though? The healthcare community as a whole has done a pretty good job securing their data at rest.
Right.
So this pretty secure, your data at rest. Applications are actually reasonably secure too. The network itself doesn't get hacked. It's the vector to the hack. But it's all the transactional environment that ends up being the source of a hacker's leverage in the network.
Right.
Part of that is based on the fact that our security model that we've articulated is static. It's based on this old principle of I build a network to do stuff, and then I do the best I can to put firewalls around it, you know,
Patch and do all kinds of-
static,
right.
you know, static stuff, and try to automate patching as best I can, or do VDI, which, by the way, that's what we're talking about here. That's a step forward. But we actually need to think of a new paradigm. The network, because of this ability to not only understand any particular element, but systemically what's going on,
Right.
allows you to think about security not as an identity-based concept anymore. That's the Snowden problem, but a behaviorally based problem. And because the network is capable of learning and automating its response, DDoS attacks is a great example of orders of magnitude improvement in responding to DDoS attacks. You really don't hear much about them anymore because
Just denial of
we've done
service
such
for
a
those that
great
don't know that
job
term.
responding to them in a fully automated way that were based on the behaviors on the network, not the alleged identities of the people in the network. You know, we partner with Palo Alto, a good example of a company that's built this zero trust model
Right.
around a behaviorally based. Well, you need a pretty smart network to be able to do behavioral response, but it gives you an ability to react at a speed that was not possible in a static deployed, a perimeter defense kind of security model. So the network itself gives you this capacity, but to use it, you actually have to have a network that's capable of doing that, and there's the dilemma.
Right. It's a double-edged sword in all of this
Exactly.
stuff. I mean, in talking to a lot of people in the white hat hacker community who, are brought in to say these various systems are extremely vulnerable, will make the point that you can guard against ransomware by having redundancies in the system,
Right.
which also, raises different security concerns, of course. But there is so much as we move into a world where everything is interconnected. The lights, the air conditioning, the garage doors, the insulin pumps. It's we get into we get into a world where so much of this is just immediately vulnerable through
IoT,
through IoT.
50 billion devices connected to the network by 2025. 50 billion, 10x increase in the number of devices connected to networks. So, and you think the network that you have today, which can't do what you want it to do, is going to be adequate to deal with that? You're fooling yourselves.
It's an extraordinary statistic. I want to, we have about a little bit more than 10 minutes, so if anyone has any burning questions, please make your way up to the microphones. And in the meantime, I heard you, Nancy, you had something to say.
Actually, no, the DDoS, for those of you who don't know, is denial of service.
Oh, yes.
We have a
I'm
tendency to talk in acronyms,
That's
sorry.
right, yeah.
Oh,
So
right.
do you, but you have different acronyms.
I started that.
You started that, yes. I think IoT, if I can just kind of bounce off of that
please.
one, IoT is, as a wireless carrier, we're, big in that, right? And constantly, actually, when Dr. Tippett worked for Verizon, we were constantly, what's the big thing in healthcare? What's the big IoT thing in healthcare? And we kept looking at them going, it's not one thing. It is a series of little things. Like we have the smart car, the smart grid, smart stuff. For certain verticals, it's easy, right? That's an easy one. Put one in every light post and you got it, right? Or stop sign. For healthcare, it's a lot of little things as it's gone through and as we've gone forward. And it is a lot of things, but not a lot of data. But you still need the expanse and coverage and footprint to be able to force them through. But the piece that's important is the data from it and the analytics that you get from that, right? So the piece of information or the bit of data that comes across is only important if it's part of a bigger story in the context for someone to use it in, right? And that analytics piece is part of that network too, whether it's offsite and ported into whatever system you want, or it's part of the analytics that the system itself does. All of that data, all of those moving parts make that creativity. Our networks will consistently get wider. You'll hear about 5G if you haven't already on the wireless network. So more impact. And that has to do with how many of you watch the NFL on your phone. How much data do you think that covers, right? So as you start to consume and use more and more video content, the pipes have to get bigger, right? And that's part of our business, and that's fine. But I forget what the average is. What is it? I think it's 4 point something number of devices per person. That's going to go crazy if you look at some of those
Absolutely.
numbers.
I think, and I mentioned this to you in the break, is I think the other mistake the healthcare industry makes is to think of this as a problem associated with the healthcare industry.
Right.
And it's not.
No.
I ask people in hospitals all the time, do you think you should be talking to the Department of Transportation? Have you ever talked to the Rural Electrification Agency? Does anybody even know what that is, right? And yet they are fundamentally responsible for creating this access environment, the Smart Cities Initiative. That's a DOT initiative. And I don't think that the healthcare industry's point of view and particular needs, in my opinion, based on being on an awful lot of task force associated with this, particularly in DOT, is appropriately reflected in considering this. They're thinking more about ubiquitous, the digital, eliminating the digital divide and all this kind of stuff. I don't think they're thinking about the Fitbit, the role that it will play, and the fact is I'm walking through Cleveland, it's in continuous contact with whatever environment I need to be receiving and processing and feeding back that data. So I think that the healthcare industry as a whole needs to maybe open up their aperture and look more broadly at some of the initiatives that may not be obviously affecting what they do, but are going to be pretty important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I've used this example before, but I had this brand new shiny iPhone in 2008, and it was just this brilliant piece of new technology. And I was in Syria, and someone had a barge. I don't know how they somehow destroyed the cable where all of the internet led to Syria. And all of a sudden, I had this beautiful piece of technology that was entirely useless to me and everybody else, and it was internet was cut off to the
wireless
entire
does not mean wireless.
Levant.
It means that there are wires to get to
Something like
there.
that.
Yes.
Right. So the network is everything.
Yeah. I also like the line, there is no cloud, it's just somebody else's data center.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Very
true.
true.
I had a CIO that said, would you just get off my cloud? Just stop. And I'm like, isn't that a song?
So I want to spend the last few minutes of this panel talking about how we scale the successful models. We went into this, I know a lot of people in the room, just talking to you folks over the break, are interested in how you have the experience of going in, you have a patient named Haley Edwards, and you all of a sudden see all of the vaccines I've received, all of my past treatment, and you know how best to treat me as a result. Or at least you know my history as a result. How do we create that on outside of California? How do we get California to talk to Nevada?
Well, I'll answer your question, and then I'll show you the other side of my own point, because I don't want to leave the impression that it solves all problems. It simply creates it does a lot of good things, but it also creates a separate set of problems. Honestly, and others may disagree, but I agreed with comments that were made at one of the earlier panels that, frankly, I think we have enough of the regulatory framework. I don't know that we need a lot more regulatory framework. I really liked the remarks that the good intentions of HIPAA, in that it tried to be flexible and not be overly prescriptive, created an environment of such uncertainty that uncertainty hardened into paranoia. Yeah. So I think a little bit more specificity within the privacy and information exchange regulations would actually go a long way towards increasing the fluidity of that exchange, because it would become clear what's permitted and what's not permitted, what can patients expect. And by setting those public expectations, that creates the precedent that will allow your internal regulatory thinkers to move forward. That's how, frankly, it became successful in California, in my view, in that once, this is an overused phrase, but it's appropriate, once the tipping point was passed, it became the community expectation that we were doing this. Mm-hmm. And so if it is the community expectation, if it becomes the patient's expectation that you're doing this, it then becomes the permissible thing to do, because you're meeting the expectations of the people whose information you're there to protect. So there really is network externality, network in the metaphorical sense, where once you pass that tipping point, it becomes much easier. And so frankly, getting out of one's own way in the local markets, I think, is the most important. I do want to touch on the other side of the coin. So we have this wonderfully dense network of healthcare systems exchanging information in California. And to tell a very quick story, someone remarked earlier about the problem of problem list reconciliation in HIE. So our EHR has a functionality for that, and I believed it was really going to be the breakthrough feature when we turned it on, because we have this dense network of information sharing, and if we just turn on the reconciliation, we will effectively have one networked problem list around the region. We turned it on, and 3 weeks later, we had to turn it off because there's no intelligence in the information exchange. So I'm a cardiologist at UCSF. I see a patient for advanced heart failure. I do a great job at that. That patient sees their primary physician 300 miles away for a plantar wart on their foot. I'm a cardiologist. Next time I open that chart, the EHR says, "Doctor, I have such good news. I'm going to help you. This patient was just diagnosed with a wart. Would you like to put that on your problem list at the electronic health record at UCSF?" Okay, is that wrong from an information standpoint? No. But is that what the cardiologist needs from their EHR? Absolutely not. And because of that dense network of information sharing that we have, we ended up resonating.
14 clicks,
We ended up having this resonant network of problems and allergies and meds bouncing all over Northern California. And it becomes overwhelming for the clinician. The clinician hasn't changed. And you might say, well, it was your bad to put that on the doctor, and there's some truth to that. But honestly, the healthcare system can't afford for a nurse to solve that problem either, or a nurse practitioner to solve that problem. So I believe the next step is that problem has to be semi-automated out of the hands of any human being, because it's too complex and also not of high value. And I don't think the HR vendors are there yet. And so having some intelligence around the information layer, I think, is going to be important as this becomes more prevalent.
This gets to the fantasy we were talking about in the first panel of some artificial intelligence that could somehow be present in a examination room and record all relevant information while not giving Dr. Daner 17 messages about each patient that are entirely irrelevant.
Not irrelevant, just not relevant to that physician
At that time.
at that time.
Precisely.
Right, and I think as you add a layer of identity of that cardiologist going in, there's analytics available and an opportunity to look at that. Those 7 of the 17 don't need to be shown because that's not where he's coming from or she's coming from. So,
Right, exactly. So is there any other place that, well, let me ask a different question. I think, I know, Phil, you mentioned federal regulations. And this and the California model came from the providers, the private sector up, and
Correct.
UCSF obviously is not private sector, but it's from the provider up.
Correct.
And there weren't, and you guys arrived at your own standards of
Correct.
sharing. So what's the model we should aim for? Is it, or what's the model? Is there agreement over which model is better? Should it be state-based, laboratory of ideas?
I mean, I think that's a thorny question, but I think Peter was up here before, and I think he said something that was very important, which is we lose sight of this as a marketplace. And I think that wherever the most efficient way to get the industry to think of itself as a marketplace is probably going to be the pressure point that's going to yield the most result. I think the other thing that we neglect is that, again, we think of healthcare and this problem, the data problem, is a healthcare problem, EMR. But at the end of the day, other industries, in fact, most other industries, are beginning to look not at from their point of view, but really turning it around and looking at it from the patient, in the case of healthcare, the patient's point of view. So look at distributed retail, how effectively they use hundreds of different data sources about a particular target, and then collect that data and optimize that experience. So yeah, they have a commercial purpose for that. They want you to buy at Macy's and not at Target. But the net result is the consumer has a sense of a much more customized experience. Yeah. And yet healthcare constrains itself only to this data around your care, rather than this broader notion that there is addressable and publicly available data that can give me a much cleaner idea of what exactly is this person's expectations and how can I predict their demands on the system. That, I think, is probably a problem that's probably solved primarily in a kind of a localized environment, because not many people are like us where we flit all over the world. Most people, stay within 60 miles of their hometown. And I think that sensitivity and that awareness can be utilized pretty efficiently to drive user satisfaction of the system.
And I think there's a movement on that because
I agree.
I agree. Healthcare is very regional. It really is. So that this problem of is it statewide? Sometimes I live in Texas. That's a big state. So yes or no, that it gets solved at the clinical or provider level of we need to interexchange information. But when you start to look at how information is looked at in a regional sector and what you're doing, what we're getting asked all the time as Verizon with 100+ million subscribers is, can you give us any data on them, right? And we don't do that, but just relax, we don't give your data away. But what that's starting to look at is how can I look at, and you'll see some of our latest acquisitions are around looking at informational sources to help our industries understand their patient, their member, their customer,
As a
to
whole
get a
person.
better customizable experience. Because when you're talking about patient experience or member experience, it's in totality. And how far back do you go? How far back should you go? And healthcare doesn't go back far enough. Healthcare has a tendency to, when you walk in my door is when my relationship starts with you. Mm-hmm. And we need to now start way back, which is where the marketers are, the retailers are. They start way back and looking at who you are and what you are and what you like. So it's starting to meld. It's not a huge wave, but it's coming.
And Russ, I didn't want to make Hippocrates roll over in his grave, but it is
Right.
a commercial enterprise.
No, I mean, I have to agree. I hate to give you this answer, but healthcare looks so different in different parts of the country.
It does.
And the scale of health systems is so varying, and the scale of what is a state. I mean, to try to do something at a statutory level in a state as big as California or Texas or Illinois probably is just intractable, right? It's very remote from the place where the care is given. Whereas maybe in some other places that'll work just great. Right. There's been, a lot of money got poured into regional health information organizations. There were a few that were successful and many, many, many that were not. Right. So unfortunately, I do think it has to be different in different places, which means it's going to be slow and uneven, which breaks my heart, but I think is just the way our system is put together, and until that changes, that's going to be the way it is. And then we need to federate those local solutions. In the absence of a national patient identifier and a federal health data repository, both of which I completely agree are not going to occur in our country anytime soon.
Unfortunately.
We're going to have to federate those local solutions, and there's work, Care Equality, and others that are moving in that direction. I think that's how we'll eventually get there.
And what do you mean by federate the local solutions?
Sure. So in California, I've described the way things work there. So if Dallas comes up with something similar, with a similar set of, it's not a technology problem, it's a similar set of agreements and data use and reciprocal support agreements and common privacy practices and common notifications of patients. Dallas develops its solution, we develop ours. Well, now maybe we can harmonize between the two. The technology is easy because they do it, but if we can make that happen between the two, then now we're federating across regions and then eventually, hopefully, across the country. If we were a smaller nation or a different kind of place, we could have solved it in a swoop, but that's probably not how it's going to happen here.
Well, I have lots more questions actually about what you do about the small hospitals that aren't in these networks, and
Really
They get bought.
they get bought up, and then you have consolidation issues.
Yep.
But we're out of time, so I wanted to ask you guys a version of the same question that I asked the last panel. In a tweet-length answer, I want you to tell me what you would do to solve these problems if you had a magic wand.
Oh boy.
And I suspect Phil might actually have an answer already in his mind. So you go first.
Well, what I do, I don't need a magic wand. I need people to start the process.
Okay.
Just start the process. Because I'd say healthcare, I'm going to guess less than 10% of the healthcare environments that we see, they recognize the problem here and here. I always say I need to push it down a little bit lower so that they start thinking seriously about solving the problem. They need to start. And that's what that would be my recommendation. There's 100 ways to begin this process, but they need to start this process. And if everyone gets on this track, the logical interconnections will become self-evident. We've seen it in the cloud service environment generally. There used to be a dozen, now there's thousands of cloud service providers, all sorts of boutique-y people. And at first they were mushrooms, and then we realized that actually fundamentally there's a way to interconnect them, either below at a data level or above in an abstraction layer. But those connections became evident through the practice of cloud service provisioning. You can't theorize that. You need to see what happens and then determine how is Dallas and San Francisco going to connect. But Dallas is not where San Francisco is. They're barely on the road, right? And so we need to get people all started on this journey. That would be my advice.
Mine is probably a little variation of his. It is to bring the collective clinical world together to see that problem, I think is what you're saying. But I think it has to be started at a clinical level or a business level. I know you hate that word, but it really has to be driven from that, not from a governance standpoint or I'm going to pay you to do this, but what's really in it for the benefit of the patients that they're serving. So if I were to do that, it would be that they're all in one room and they say, okay, we'll do it. Because that's really where it stops.
And I guess I'll close by pointing out that all of these things that we're talking about are means to an end, right? None of these things, security, privacy, networks, none of them are part of the mission of healthcare, right? These are all infrastructure enablers so that we can keep people healthy and make them feel better when they're sick and try to take good care of them. So if I had, you did say magic wand, it would be a single set of security standards, a single set of privacy standards, and a single set of fully interoperable application programming interfaces. And then let's let 1 million people innovate on top of that layer so that we can stop talking about all of the rest of this. Because I don't want to call it a necessary evil, because that's the wrong thing. But all of this is simply infrastructure so that we can try to keep people well or get them well when they're not. And I'd just like us to solve all that through a single set of regulations and solutions, and then we can go back to trying to do great things on top of that infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much. We've gone from siloed pipes all the way up to
Nirvana.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you so much, the three of you, for your insight. It was really lovely to talk.
Great.
Thank you.